If you are over 60 and you've been taking magnesium glycinate along with vitamin D3 and K2, or someone has advised you to start this exact combination, then what I'm about to explain could completely change how you look at your daily supplements. Not in a fear-driven way, but in a way that helps you understand what is actually happening inside your body right now. Because the truth is, this combination is often promoted as something simple, safe, and even essential for aging health. But when it is used without proper understanding, it can quietly create problems that most people never connect back to their supplements until it is too late. I've seen this firsthand in clinical settings. People come in genuinely believing they are protecting their bones, supporting their heart, improving their sleep, and strengthening their muscles. On paper, it looks like they are doing everything right. But when we actually run tests and look deeper, the picture is sometimes very different. The concerning part is not that these nutrients are harmful on their own. Magnesium, vitamin D3, and vitamin K2 are all important for human health. The real issue is how they are being combined, at what doses, at what age, and alongside which medications. Especially after 60, your body is no longer processing and regulating minerals and vitamins the way it used to. And that changes everything about how these supplements behave once they enter your system. Let's start with magnesium glycinate because it has become one of the most commonly used forms of magnesium, especially for older adults. The reason is simple. It is gentle on the stomach, highly absorbable, and does not usually cause the digestive upset that other forms like magnesium citrate can cause. It is also bound to glycine, an amino acid that has a calming effect on the nervous system, which is why many people report better sleep, reduced anxiety, and fewer muscle cramps when they take it. Magnesium itself is involved in hundreds of processes in the body, from nerve signaling to muscle contraction, blood sugar balance, and even bone health. In many ways, it is essential for keeping the entire system running smoothly. But this is where things start to shift, especially in people over 60. One of the most important changes that happens with age is a gradual decline in kidney function. Even if you feel perfectly healthy and have never been diagnosed with kidney disease, your kidneys are not filtering blood at the same efficiency they did decades earlier. This is a natural part of aging, but it has serious implications for anything you take that needs to be cleared through the kidneys, magnesium included. When kidney function slows down, the body can become less efficient at removing excess magnesium. If you are supplementing on top of dietary intake, that excess can slowly build up in the bloodstream without you noticing. This condition is known as hypermagnesemia, and it is more common in older adults than most people realize because the early signs are easy to miss. At first, it may feel like mild fatigue, slight nausea, facial flushing, or a sense of mental fog that is hard to explain. Most people would never associate these symptoms with something as ordinary as a magnesium supplement. But if levels continue to rise, the effects become more serious. Blood pressure can drop too low, heart rhythms can become irregular, breathing can feel difficult, and in severe cases, it can even lead to cardiac complications. The important thing to understand here is not that magnesium is dangerous by default, but that in an aging body with reduced clearance ability, even a helpful mineral can become problematic if it is not properly monitored or dosed. And this is only the beginning of the story because magnesium does not exist in isolation when you combine it with vitamin D3 and vitamin K2. Each of these nutrients interacts with the others in ways that are not always obvious at first glance. And once they are stacked together in an older system, the balance becomes even more delicate than most people expect. Now let's bring vitamin D3 into this picture because this is where the combination starts to look especially harmless on the surface while becoming more complex underneath. Vitamin D3, also known as cholecalciferol, is often called the sunshine vitamin, and for good reason. As people age, the skin becomes less efficient at producing vitamin D from sunlight, and many older adults also spend less time outdoors. On top of that, diet alone usually does not provide enough. As a result, Vitamin D deficiency is extremely common in people over 60, and it has been linked with a wide range of health concerns, including weaker bones, higher fracture risk, reduced immune function, low mood, cognitive decline, and even increased long-term disease risk. Because of this, vitamin D3 supplementation is widely recommended, and in many cases, it genuinely makes sense. But what is often not fully explained is how strongly vitamin D3 influences calcium absorption in the body. One of its main biological roles is to increase the amount of calcium your intestines pull from food. This is not a side effect, it is one of its core functions. Under normal conditions, this is beneficial because calcium is essential for bone strength, muscle contraction, nerve communication, and heart function. The problem begins when vitamin D3 intake is high, especially in people who are already supplementing or whose baseline levels are very low and then aggressively corrected. When more calcium is absorbed than the body immediately needs, the system has to manage that excess. Ideally, calcium should be directed into bones and teeth where it supports structure and strength. But when regulation is not perfectly balanced, calcium can start to circulate in the bloodstream in higher amounts than intended. Over time, this raises a concern that becomes particularly important in older adults: calcium deposition in soft tissues. This is where calcium begins to settle in places it should not be, such as arteries, heart valves, kidneys, and other soft tissues. This process is known as vascular calcification, and it is not something that happens overnight. It develops gradually and often without obvious symptoms in the early stages. The danger is that people can feel completely normal while this process is slowly progressing in the background. Over time, however, it contributes to stiffness in blood vessels, increased cardiovascular strain, and a higher risk of serious events like heart attack or stroke. The key point here is not that vitamin D3 is harmful, but that its effect on calcium metabolism needs to be understood in context, especially when combined with other supplements that influence mineral balance. This is exactly where vitamin K2 is usually introduced as the missing piece in the equation. Vitamin K2 plays a critical role in directing calcium to the right places in the body. It activates specific proteins such as osteocalcin, which helps move calcium into bones and teeth, and matrix GLA protein, which helps prevent calcium from accumulating in arteries and soft tissues. In theory, this creates a very logical system. Vitamin D3 increases calcium absorption, and vitamin K2 ensures that calcium is guided into the correct locations. This idea has led to the popular recommendation that D3 and K2 should always be taken together, and in many cases, that combination does work well. However, the situation becomes more complicated in real-world conditions, especially in older adults. The effectiveness of vitamin K2 is not identical for everyone, and it can be influenced by the form being used, individual absorption differences, and, very importantly, medication use. There are two main forms of vitamin K, two commonly found in supplements, MK4 and MK7. MK4 acts quickly, but leaves the body relatively fast, while MK7 stays active much longer in the bloodstream. Because of this, MK7 is the form most commonly used in supplements. However, its long-lasting effect also means it has a more sustained influence on the body's clotting system, which is where an important concern arises for a significant portion of people over 60. If someone is taking blood-thinning medications such as warfarin, vitamin K2 can directly interfere with how that medication works. Warfarin functions by limiting the recycling of vitamin K in the body, which reduces blood clot formation. When additional vitamin K2 is introduced through supplements, it can counteract this effect and make blood clotting less predictable. This can lead to unstable INR levels, which is the clinical measure used to monitor how thin or thick the blood is. If INR becomes too low, clotting risk increases. If it becomes too high, bleeding risk increases. Both situations can be dangerous. This is not theoretical. There are documented cases where individuals began taking vitamin K2 on their own without informing their healthcare provider and later experience serious instability in their anticoagulation levels. The key issue here is not that vitamin K2 is inherently unsafe, but that it has a direct biochemical relationship with certain medications that requires careful monitoring. So when vitamin D3 and K2 are combined and then magnesium is added into the same system, the interactions become even more layered. Magnesium is actually required for vitamin D to be activated in the body. Vitamin D undergoes two conversion steps, first in the liver and then in the kidneys. And both of these processes depend on magnesium-dependent enzymes. This means magnesium is not just coexisting with vitamin D, it is actively influencing how well vitamin D functions in the body. At first glance, this sounds like a perfect synergy. Magnesium helps activate vitamin D increases calcium absorption, and vitamin K2 directs calcium to the right locations. But when you step back and look at the entire system in an aging body, especially one that may already have reduced kidney function or be taking multiple medications, this coordinated system becomes much more sensitive than it appears. Even small imbalances in one part of the chain can affect the others in ways that are not immediately visible, which is why understanding the full interaction matters far more than simply knowing the benefits of each supplement individually. When you combine magnesium glycinate, vitamin D3, and vitamin K2 together in a person over 60, the interaction between them becomes far more important than the individual benefits each one provides on its own. On paper, this combination is often described as supportive and even complementary. But inside a real biological system that is aging and adapting, the story becomes more sensitive and less predictable than most people are told. The key point to understand is that magnesium is not just another mineral in this stack. It is actually required for vitamin D to function properly in the body. Vitamin D does not work in its active form immediately after you take it. It must first be converted in the liver and then again in the kidneys before it becomes biologically active. Both of these conversion steps rely heavily on magnesium-dependent enzymes. Without sufficient magnesium, vitamin D may not be activated efficiently, which means you could take vitamin D regularly but still not fully experience its intended effects. This is why many people assume that combining magnesium with vitamin D is always a good idea, and in many cases it is helpful. However, the complication begins when you consider what vitamin D is actually doing once it becomes active. One of its most powerful effects is increasing calcium absorption from the digestive system. So when magnesium improves vitamin D activation and vitamin D increases calcium absorption, you are essentially strengthening both sides of the process at the same time. In a younger, well-regulated body, this balance is usually handled without issue. But in older adults, where kidney function, hormonal regulation, and mineral balance are already changing, this amplified effect can become harder to control. At this stage, vitamin K2 is expected to act as a regulatory safeguard. Its job is to make sure that the extra calcium being absorbed does not end up in the wrong places. It activates proteins like osteocalcin, which helps deposit calcium into bones and teeth, and matrix GLA protein, which helps prevent calcium from accumulating in arteries and soft tissues. In theory, this creates a clean and efficient system where calcium is absorbed, directed, and used correctly. But the reality is that this system does not operate in isolation. It is influenced by age-related changes in metabolism, kidney efficiency, dietary intake, and most importantly, medications. In older adults, the body's ability to maintain stable mineral levels becomes less flexible. Small changes in intake or absorption can have larger effects than they would in younger individuals. This is especially important when multiple supplements are taken at the same time because they are not acting independently. They are influencing each other continuously. Another critical interaction that often goes unnoticed is the competition between magnesium and calcium in the digestive system. Both minerals use overlapping transport pathways for absorption. This means that when they are present in the gut at the same time, they can interfere with each other's uptake to some degree. If someone is taking magnesium supplements alongside a diet or supplement regimen that is also high in calcium, often influenced indirectly by vitamin D3, the balance between these minerals can become unpredictable. In some cases, the body may absorb less of one mineral than expected, or the timing of absorption may shift in ways that make blood levels less stable. This unpredictability is important because the body does not simply store and ignore these fluctuations. Calcium, magnesium, and vitamin D are tightly regulated because they affect critical systems such as the heart, nervous system, and muscles. Even small imbalances over time can influence how these systems behave, especially in older adults whose physiological buffering capacity is reduced compared to younger individuals. The situation becomes even more complex when prescription medications are part of the equation, which is very common in people over 60. Magnesium, for example, can interfere with the absorption of certain antibiotics, reducing their effectiveness. It can also interact with medications used for osteoporosis, potentially affecting how those drugs work in the body. Some blood pressure medications and diuretics further complicate magnesium balance because they can either increase magnesium loss or increase retention depending on the specific drug. Vitamin D3 also has its own set of interactions. When combined with certain medications such as steroids or specific diuretics, it can contribute to elevated calcium levels in the blood. This condition, known as hypercalcemia, can develop gradually and may not be immediately obvious in its early stages. However, as calcium levels rise, symptoms can begin to appear, including confusion, unusual thirst, frequent urination, digestive discomfort, muscle weakness, and in more severe cases, irregular heart rhythm or kidney-related complications. The important takeaway from all of this is not that these supplements are inherently unsafe, but that their combined effects are far more dynamic than most people realize. Magnesium enhances vitamin D activation, vitamin D increases calcium absorption, and vitamin K2 attempts to regulate calcium distribution. At the same time, magnesium and calcium can compete for absorption, and all three can be influenced by medications commonly used in older populations. When you put all of this together, the system becomes highly dependent on balance, timing, dosage, and individual health status rather than a simple one-size-fits-all approach. When all three supplements, magnesium, glycinate, vitamin D3, and vitamin K2 are taken together consistently in someone over 60, the most important issue is not the individual nutrients anymore, but the way their combined effects can quietly shift the body's mineral balance over time. This is where the situation moves from supplementation into something much closer to a tightly regulated internal system that requires careful oversight. One of the most overlooked dynamics in this combination is how calcium, magnesium, and vitamin D indirectly influence each other in a feedback loop. Vitamin D increases calcium absorption, magnesium supports vitamin D activation, and calcium itself competes with magnesium for absorption in the gut. This means that even the timing of when you take each supplement can influence how much of each mineral your body actually absorbs. If these nutrients are taken too closely together, especially alongside calcium-rich meals or other supplements, the absorption process becomes less predictable. Instead of the body receiving a steady and balanced supply, it may experience fluctuations that are harder to regulate internally. For a younger body, these fluctuations are usually managed without major consequences because the kidneys, hormones, and cellular regulation systems are more adaptable. However, after 60, these same systems begin to lose some of their flexibility. Kidney filtration naturally declines with age, hormonal signaling becomes less efficient, and the body's ability to quickly correct mineral imbalances is reduced. This does not mean the system fails, but it does mean it responds more slowly and less precisely to changes in intake. This is also where medication use becomes a critical factor that cannot be ignored. Many people over 60 are taking multiple prescriptions, and several of these can directly influence how magnesium and calcium behave in the body. For example, certain diuretics can increase magnesium loss through urine, which may lead to lower magnesium levels over time unless it is carefully replaced. On the other hand, some medications can reduce magnesium excretion, which raises the risk of accumulation if supplementation is not adjusted accordingly. Magnesium also has a known interaction with several commonly prescribed antibiotics. It can bind to these medications in the digestive tract and reduce their absorption, which may decrease their effectiveness. Similarly, medications used for osteoporosis can be effective if taken too close to magnesium supplements, potentially interfering with how well they are absorbed into the body. Vitamin D3 introduces another layer of complexity when combined with certain drug classes. Some medications, including specific steroids and thiazide-type diuretics, can influence calcium metabolism. When vitamin D3 is also increasing calcium absorption at the same time, the combined effect can occasionally push calcium levels higher than intended. This does not happen in everyone, but when it does, it can create a condition known as elevated blood calcium, which may not produce obvious symptoms at first. The early signs of calcium imbalance are often subtle and easy to dismiss. People may notice mild fatigue, changes in urination, frequency, increased thirst, digestive discomfort, or a general sense that something feels off without being able to clearly identify why. Because these symptoms are nonspecific, they are often attributed to aging itself rather than a biochemical imbalance. This is one of the reasons why monitoring becomes so important when using these supplements long term. Another layer that is often underestimated is the cumulative effect of long-term supplementation. Even when each individual dose appears reasonable, consistent daily intake over months or years can gradually shift baseline mineral levels. This does not necessarily lead to immediate problems, but it can slowly alter how the body regulates calcium distribution, kidney workload, and cardiovascular mineral balance. These changes are typically silent until they reach a point where routine blood work finally reveals them. Vitamin K2 is often positioned as the protective factor in this system, and in many ways, it does play an important role. By activating proteins that guide calcium into bones and away from arteries, it helps maintain proper calcium distribution. However, its effectiveness still depends on overall physiological balance. It cannot fully override issues caused by excessive calcium intake, impaired kidney function, or drug interactions. It works best as part of a stable system, not as a correction for an already imbalanced one. This is why the idea of simply taking all three supplements together without context can be misleading. The combination is not inherently wrong, but it is highly dependent on individual health status, kidney function, existing calcium levels, magnesium status, vitamin D, baseline, diet, and medication use all influence how safely and effectively this stack operates in the body. At this point, the most important question is not whether magnesium glycinate, vitamin D3, and vitamin K2 are good or bad, but whether they are being used in a way that actually matches the condition of the body taking them. Because in people over 60, the body is no longer operating with the same margin of safety it once had. The systems that regulate minerals, hormones, and kidney clearance are still working, but they are working with less flexibility, which means small imbalances can matter much more than they used to. When all of this is brought together, a clearer picture starts to form. Magnesium is essential, but it is cleared through the kidneys, which naturally decline with age. Vitamin D3 is widely needed, but it strongly increases calcium absorption, which must be carefully managed. Vitamin K2 plays an important regulatory role, but its interaction with blood-thinning medications like warfarin makes it highly sensitive in a significant portion of older adults. When these three are combined, they do not act independently, they interact continuously, and those interactions can either support balance or quietly disrupt it depending on the individual. This is why a one-size-fits-all approach is where problems often begin. Many people start these supplements based on general advice, online recommendations, or well-meaning suggestions from others without ever checking whether their body actually needs that specific combination or dose. Over time, this can lead to a situation where mineral levels drift outside their optimal range without any obvious warning signs. The body does not always send loud signals when something is slightly off. In fact, many of the early changes in calcium or magnesium imbalance are silent and only become visible through blood work. This is also why relying only on how you feel can be misleading. Someone may feel completely normal, while subtle shifts are occurring in their calcium distribution, kidney workload, or cardiovascular mineral balance. Energy levels, sleep quality, or muscle comfort are not reliable indicators of whether blood, calcium, or magnesium levels are truly within a safe range. These are internal biochemical processes, and they require objective testing to understand accurately. For this reason, the most responsible approach is not avoidance, but awareness and monitoring. Before starting or continuing this combination long-term, especially after 60, it becomes important to understand your baseline status. That includes checking magnesium levels, vitamin D levels, calcium levels, and kidney function. These values provide the context needed to decide whether supplementation is actually necessary, and if so, at what dose and frequency. Once supplementation begins, it should not be treated as a permanent fixed routine without review. The body changes over time, kidney function can shift gradually, vitamin D levels can rise more quickly in some individuals than others, and dietary habits can also influence mineral balance. This means periodic reassessment is not optional if the goal is long-term safety. Adjustments are often needed even if the initial regimen was correct. Timing and spacing also remain important. Magnesium is often better tolerated when taken separately from calcium-rich meals or other competing minerals. Vitamin D3 and K2 are typically better absorbed with dietary fat, which means they often fit better with main meals rather than being taken on an empty stomach. These small details may seem minor, but over time, they influence how consistently the body absorbs and utilizes each nutrient. It is also important to recognize that supplements are not a substitute for foundational nutrition. Many of the nutrients people try to replace with pills are already present in food. Magnesium can be found in leafy greens, nuts, seeds, legumes, and whole grains. Vitamin K2 is present in foods like egg yolks, certain cheeses, grass-fed dairy, and fermented foods such as natto. Vitamin D can be supported through sunlight exposure and fatty fish like salmon and mackerel. When diet is strong, the need for high-dose supplementation often decreases significantly.